Okay, let's wrap up our discussion of Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy. We left off last time talking about a morally permissible action according to his categorical imperative. So if we form the maxim, in circumstances X, I will do Y, a subjective principle of action. When I have free time and I'm in the mood to play guitar, I will. That's subjective. Now we imagine it as a universal law. Whenever anyone has free time and they're in the mood, they will play guitar. Do we hit a contradiction in conception or will? The answer to both those questions is no and no, because when we imagine ourselves in such a world where that is the law of the land, would it be difficult or impossible to act on this maxim? Would it be difficult or impossible to play to play guitar when we have free time and are in the mood? No, it would not be difficult or impossible. So no contradiction in conception. And is this a world that a rational person would choose to participate in? And the answer is yes. So no contradiction of will. That doesn't tell us that playing guitar when you want is a moral requirement or a moral duty. It just says that it's morally allowable, it's morally permissible, which is exactly what we would expect. Of course, when you have free time and you're in the mood, go ahead, play guitar. There's nothing immoral about that. Okay, that was a recap. Let's move on to new things. So in Kant's own words, his CI, his categorical process, the subjective principles of actions, like we said, those are maxims, they must always be adopted in such a way that they can hold as objective, I hold as universal principles. So we're not allowed to have double standards. We can't have rules that apply only to us and not others. We must act in such a way that if our personal rules happen to be the rules for everyone, that there wouldn't be moral chaos. How can I know whether or not a deceitful promise is consistent with duty? The shortest way to go about finding out is also the surest. It is to ask myself, would I be content for my maxim of getting out of a difficulty through a false promise to hold as a universal law? So would I be okay if others were allowed to lie? You know, when we ask people, would you be okay if everyone else were allowed to lie, or were allowed to not help each other out, or allowed to let their talents rust, or allowed to kill themselves when they're in a bad mood? No, we wouldn't think those are good laws for other people, and so they can't be good laws for ourselves. There would be it would be inconsistent. There would be a contradiction in that, so it would be irrational. That is tantamount or equal to asking, could I say to myself that anyone might make a false promise when he is in a difficulty and he can't get out of any other way? Some actions are so constituted that their maxim can't even be thought of as a universal law of nature without contradiction. So this is a contradiction in conception, let alone being willed to be such. It's easy to see that an action of that kind conflicts with a stricter, more narrow, or absolutely obligatory duty. Those are the perfect duties, like the duty to not lie or have a deceitful promise, and the duty to not commit suicide. With other actions, the maxim made universal law is not in that way internally impossible, so there's no contradiction in conception, but there's still something that no one could possibly will to be universal law, because a will would self-contradict itself. That's when we hit a contradiction in will. It would go against our will to participate in such a world. I'll let you read that on your own. So again, loosely, no double standards. Would you let others break their promises or commit suicide? No, then you shouldn't break your own promises or commit suicide in your own case. Would you allow your kids to be selfish or lazy, to think of the other cases? Well, every once in a while, that's okay, but you're not always allowed. It's sometimes impermissible to be selfish or lazy. Here's the second formulation of the categorical imperative. It is the respect for humanity version of the principle. Suppose that there was someone who existed whose existence in itself had absolute value, something which as an end in itself could support determinate laws. That would be a basis, indeed the only basis, for a possible categorical imperative, i.e. of a practical law. There is such a thing! Exclamation point! It is a human being! I maintain that man, or human, and in general, every rational being exists as an end in theirselves, himself, and not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. So in short, what he's saying is act in such a way always to treat humanity, whether in your own person, talking about you, or in anyone else, always as an end, and never, and here's a very key word, merely as a means. So we're not allowed to exploit people. So you have to treat people, yourself included, with dignity and respect for their autonomy. And you can't use people, you can't use them as a mere means to an end. You can use people as means, just not merely as a means. So for instance, right now, you're using me as a means to something. A means to what? To your education, to a grade, to part of your degree, part of a life goal. And I'm using you as a means for my job, for my salary, to make a living. So we're using each other, but notice we're not using each other merely as means. So if you don't do any of your assignments and you write nasty emails about me to other people that are unjustified, or if you're in a class with an instructor and you're falling asleep, or you're on your phone the whole time showing up late, or you follow the instructor back to their car and you slash their tires when they're not looking, that would be using them for an end, to get a grade, to get units, to help your goal of transfer or certificate, whatever it is. But you're not doing it with respect, so you're treating them merely as a means. And if I recycled my lectures and showed up to class late and gave people grades randomly or, based on prejudice, stereotype reasons, that would be me treating you merely as a means. So you can treat people as a means, just not merely as a means. In short, you're not allowed to exploit people. That's the second formulation of the categorical imperative, the respect for humanity or for human persons. Now, according to Kant, the first formulation, the universalization formulation, and the second one are supposed to be equivalent. But it's not clear that they are equivalent. So that's one issue that comes up. Here are some other problems for Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy. Number one, is it true that only rational agents have moral worth? So for Kant, if you were going to be covered, if you imagine morality or moral coverage like a healthcare plan, who is covered? Well, under Kant's plan, the only people or the only things that are covered, or beings that are covered, are rational beings, or what he calls rational agents, people who can participate in the moral system. So that would count people like me and you, but it actually would discount a lot of human beings, because not every human being is as rational as a healthy adult human being. When we're younger, we're not fully there yet. Toward the end of our life, sometimes we lose our rationality. Sometimes there's an accident or there's some disease that affects our rationality. And what about non-human animals? Many of them don't have rationality or can reason or use logic on par with adult healthy humans. So they're not covered under the healthcare plan or the moral philosophy plan. And a lot of philosophers take issue with that and say, under Kant's plan or his system, we would be justified in exploiting animals since they're not rational agents. They wouldn't fall under they wouldn't be covered under the second version of the categorical imperative. Now, Kant actually wrote about the abuse of animals, and he did argue that abusing them is immoral, but his rationale sounds a little funny from many philosophers' perspective. He argued that the reason it's immoral is not because it's inherently wrong to abuse an innocent animal. It's wrong because it might be a slippery slope. That behavior of torturing or exploiting innocent animals might be a slippery slope into torturing and exploiting human beings. So he kind of got the right answer, but for the wrong reason. Many people would say, Well, even if you had a crystal ball and you knew that someone who was nasty to dogs and cats and tortured them was never in the future ever going to do that to a human being, you would still say that the torture of the innocent animals was wrong. So it's more than just it might lead to the torture, exploitation of human beings. It's wrong for at least one of the reasons, maybe even wrong in and of itself. And that's a problem number one for Kant. Number two, maybe it's too strict. It's too black and white. It's too absolute. Doesn't have enough flexibility. So there's this French thinker named Benjamin Constant, and he came up with this thought experiment, this case where imagine that a murderer knocks on your door and they're looking for your neighbor, and they say, hey, knock, knock, knock. Hey, I'm a murderer. I'm looking for your neighbor. I'm going to murder them. And suppose that you know where your neighbor is. Should you tell the inquiring murderer where your neighbor is? Most of us would say, of course not. You would want to do the opposite. You would want to lie to protect your neighbor. But for Kant, he sticks to his guns. He bites the bullet. Or at least that's how many people interpret him. And argues that lying is absolutely wrong, even in a strange case like this. So Kant actually responds to this case and sticks to his guns. He bites the bullet and says, no, it's still wrong, even in that case. So that's a strange... it's good he's being committed to his view, but is he overly committed to his own view? Now, one thing that we might be able to give Kant some credit for with respect to this inquiring murderer case is he said that while it's not okay to outright lie, it's okay to be honest in a clever way. So, for instance, let's say that you got framed for a crime, say murder, and the police are looking for the murderer, but they don't know what the murderer looks like. So you've been framed. The cops are after you. And let's say that they happen to be in your neighborhood knocking on doors. They knock on your door and they say, hey, do you know if the murderer is around? If your response was something clever like, they're nearby, notice that's true. It's not a lie, but you didn't have to give yourself up because you know you're innocent. So that would, maybe there are some clever ways around lying, perhaps, but it's probably a stretch to imagine that this clever tactic would get us out of these tough thought experiments like the inquiring murderer every time. Okay, number 3. Seems like the categorical imperative is subject to counterexamples. So I had a philosophy professor at UC Santa Barbara where I got my bachelor's degree from Professor Hanser. And he said, what if your maxim is this? When you're at a sporting event, like say a baseball game, and it's late in the game, say like the 7th inning, and your team is down by an almost insurmountable amount of runs, like 10 runs, then I will leave the game early to avoid traffic. So in short, when the game's a blowout, I'll leave early to avoid traffic. Let's universalize it. Whenever the game's a blowout, everyone will leave early to avoid the traffic. Now, is there a contradiction of conception? Arguably, yes. Would it be difficult or impossible to act on the maxim if it were universalized? It would be difficult, wouldn't it? Because you're trying to leave the game early, and what would make it difficult? Well, if everyone's trying to leave early, that's going to create the very traffic that you're trying to avoid. And since it would be difficult or impossible to act on the maxim, we hit a contradiction of conception, which means, drum roll, perfect duty, to not act on the maxim. So the consequence of applying this case to the categorical imperative is we get the answer, it's always wrong to leave baseball games early when we're trying to avoid traffic. But that sounds counterintuitive. There doesn't seem it seems completely morally acceptable to leave a baseball game early if you want to beat the traffic. Is there anything wrong about that? Doesn't seem like it, but on Kant's view, the answer seems to be yes. So that's number 3. Number 4, do consequences really count for nothing? For Kant, the only part of a person that we should evaluate when we're trying to figure out right and wrong is their intention. Intention. Did they intend to follow the categorical imperative or not? Well, is it really true that consequences count for nothing? Take the case of attempted murder and successful murder. Compare it to successful murder. Are the intentions different in those two cases, attempted murder and successful murder? No, the intentions are not different. They're the same. In both cases, a person intended to murder someone. The only difference between the two cases are the consequences. In the attempted murder case, there are no negative consequences. No one got killed. Somebody tried to kill someone but failed. In the successful murder case, the consequences are wildly different. Instead of no harm occurring, a great harm occurred. A death, a killing, a murder. Now, if we're going to consider what the punishment should be in these two cases, if you go with Kant's view, the punishment for them, drumroll please, should be the same. Why? Because the punishment, on his view, would be based solely on the intention. And in both cases, the intention is the same. So ask yourself, just from your common sense or your moral intuitions, do you think attempted murder and successful murder should be punished in the same way? Most people, most clear-thinking, rational people would argue, no, successful murder is worse and deserves a harsher punishment. But we can't give that harsher punishment if we stick with strict Kantian ethics. Now we're going to look at the consequentialists, like the utilitarians, like Mill and Bentham soon. And they're going to argue, forget the intentions, it's all about the consequences. So the utilitarians, they seem to get the answer right in the difference between, in punishment between successful and attempted murder. They would say, you got to punish the successful murder much more. Although they might have a problem with attempted murder, because if there's no risk of the person doing it again, then the person wouldn't receive any punishment. But you could say, oh, but there's we need to deter that person from maybe attempting the killing or the murder of somebody else. So maybe it wouldn't be problematic for them. But for Kant, it certainly is. And then finally, we get to number 5, can reason alone motivate? For David Hume, reason alone never motivates. That's one of his 4 theses, if you will. But Kant argues in some cases, in these moral cases, reason alone can motivate us. Yes, sometimes we do the right thing, and we happen to want to do the right thing. And if so, Kant would say, big thumbs up, that's great. But what about the cases where people do the right thing, but they didn't want to do the right thing? He would argue that's a case where reason alone motivates. Because you acted morally, like maybe you would love to lie. Louis C.K., that comedian that I probably talked about before, he jokingly says, lying fixes everything. He's trying to teach his children right from wrong, and secretly he wants to tell them lying fixes everything, but he can't. He knows he needs to tell them that it's bad, even though it really is great and it fixes everything. But on many cases, we do the right thing. We don't lie. So we didn't want to tell the truth, but we did. So what motivated us? For Kant, it is this reasoning that it's the right thing to do. But is there really no desire there? David Hume would say there's always a desire there. It's It's an empirical psychological claim, and the answer is always yes, just as how we're hardwired. Kant disagrees. Okay, almost through here. On the matter of can reason alone motivate, Kant calls this pure practical reason. He says, how can pure reason, after the colon in the first line, all by itself, without any outside help from action drivers, be practical? How can this mere principle of universal validity, blah, 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 be an action driver and produce an interest that would be called purely moral? In short, how can pure reason be practical? And he goes on to say, all human reason is wholly incompetent to explain this, and it is a waste of trouble and labor to try. What a cop-out! So you press Kant, hey, you're writing this essay, you've thought about it for a long time, what's your answer? How could reason alone motivate? And he says, it's really, really hard, you can't really, it's just a waste of time to try, just believe me, take my word for it. So it's just kind of funny. Maybe elsewhere Kant backs this up, but there's this little section in the reading that we had where he kind of gets away with this really inadequate explanation. Okay, last little bit on Kant, and this will be a bridge between his line of thinking and Hume's, and whether or not reason alone motivates. So this is a paper from the 80s from a British philosopher, David Lewis, very smart contemporary philosopher, and he writes about the anti-Humean challenge. A Humean, notice it says Humean, not human, a Humean thesis about motivation says that we are moved entirely by desire, right? So you need desire if you're going to act. We are disposed to do what will serve our desires according to our beliefs. If there were no desires to serve, there would never be action, there would never be movement. Now, according to Kant, sometimes there are no desires, but we act, maybe because we know it's the right thing. Whatever might happen then would be entirely unmotivated. Here I shall uphold Humeanism, don't you love that, against one sort of opponent. Our anti-Humean challenge us with this case. So it's going to be a case where seemingly somebody acts without any desire. So imagine there's a philosophy department and they need to choose between two candidates for a job, one named mean and one named nice. Nice is your old friend, affable, sensible, fair-minded, cooperative, moderate. Mean is quite the opposite. But it's clear that mean, if you're going to just judge them on merit alone, is just a little bit better at philosophy. Gritting your teeth and defying all desire, you vote for mean because you believe that mean getting the job instead of nice would, all things considered, be the right thing to do, be good. Your belief about what's good has moved you against your desire for nice as a colleague, even though you want to have nothing to do with mean. So, hey, Kant, good for you. Ding, ding, ding. Don't you think Kant wins? Here's a case where you're motivated to act. It wasn't because of desire. Desire was actually pushing you in the other direction. And you acted because of belief, because of knowledge, because you reasoned out is the right thing to do. Here's what David Lewis has to say about this. We humans reply that there are desires and then there are desires. So what he's going to say is, you haven't looked at the whole picture. Yes, you've noted a desire to do the opposite of the action that was performed. And it looks like it was just belief and reason and logic and the moral knowledge of the moral law alone that got us to act. We knew that mean getting the job was the right thing, and that's what motivated us to act. But David Lewis is saying, don't forget there can be other desires, and our desires can be conflicting. So when you zoom out, there's more to this picture. There's the belief that mean getting the job is morally correct. It's what we should do. There's a desire to give the job to nice. We give the job to mean. But for Lewis, there's also a desire there to do the right thing. Or a desire to not be biased toward people who are warm and likable. He continues, some desires, for instance, your desire to have nice as a colleague, are warm. You feel enthusiasm. You take pleasure in the prospect of fulfillment. Other desires, for instance, your desire to hire the best available candidate, are what Lewis calls cold. So when we originally told the story, we left out what Lewis calls the cold desires. And the cold desires are what can motivate us to do what's morally right, even when there are no warm desires. So earlier I talked about a case where we want to lie, but we know it's wrong, so we don't. So there's a warm desire to lie. It kind of would give us pleasure, be the easy way out. But we tell the truth because we know it's the right thing. But that didn't motivate us alone, says David Lewis and Hume. So in the end, he's taking Hume's side. What motivated us was a desire to be an honest person, right? Or to do the right thing, or to fulfill our duty. Why can't we have a desire for duty? Nobody ever said that only the warm desires can move us. It is not so that you defied all desire when you voted for me. Yes, you defied one of your desires, your warm desire, but you did not defy your cold desires. You were moved entirely by desire. However, the cold desire outweighed the warm one. We are within our rights to construe desire inclusively to cover the entire range of states that move us, including, for instance, the state that moved you to vote for me. Humanism, understood in this inclusive way, is surely true. Maybe a trivial truth, but a trivial truth is still a truth. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for listening.